morning lessons comes from 1 Samuel, chapter 8, verses 1 through 22. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for you then a king to govern us, like other nations." But the things displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them, and will show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for them himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow their ground and to reap their harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be performers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his countries. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to him officers and to his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flock, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Samuel then said to the people of Israel, "Each of you return home." The reading of the word.
Can I have you guys, right here, the two boys, can I have you guys come up and bring the chair up, would you please? Yeah, same as last week, if you would. So we've been talking for the last week or so, the birth of the Christ is found in the book of Matthew. And while the boys are moving our little prop out here, you can just drag it, boys. The question that we're asking ourselves is, who is the right to sit at the throne of your heart? Now, last week we explored the idea that a king from the world would be one who would rule over us. And this week we're going to talk about probably the worst king of all, which is us, ourselves. You see, when we rule ourselves, we typically make a big mess of it, and we need someone wiser than us. Now, in Matthew, as we went through last week, again, the whole idea is that there was this idea of the king of the Jews was being born, and that's why these men from afar came to go look for him. Herod was afraid of him, tried to kill all the babies. In this passage here, we have the people of Israel who had been suffering under other nations coming in and ruling over them during the time of the judges, and so they asked for a king, because they're thinking, if we have a king, he'll protect us and do all this great stuff for us. But the problem is, again, what, as you saw here in the word as Bill read it, is that when they did so, they rejected the real king. So again, the problem is this. We desire for the right king to be at the center of our life, But too many times we fail to recognize what he looks like and how to know if we have the right person there. Have you ever felt like a total failure? I know I have in my life. We have obligations and sometimes we fail to meet them. We make promises and we break them. We have commitments and we fail to follow through with them. Here's the thing that happens all the time, and anybody who's working knows this. We tend to focus on the urgent rather than that which is important. And so we tend to want to have someone in charge, and that's why we'll ask for a king. But typically what happens is after time is we realize if it needs to get done, we probably have to do it ourselves. And so we put ourselves on that throne. So we're going to study out of 1 Samuel here, and we're going to talk about the decisions that they made and how that makes a decision and how that's hard on us. So last week I introduced this idea that everyone has a table in their mind and heart, and there's people sitting around that table who have input into your life. One of the questions that was raised by someone after the service last week was the idea that some people has less influence than others. I mentioned to you that my biological father, he raised me until I was about 18 and went off to college, and he taught me how to work hard, and he taught me how to build homes and all kinds of stuff. But he was also a very severe alcoholic and still is to this day. He's a very lonely man. And so what I have done in my own life is I have actually moved him down the table towards the end. He has less influence on me today than he did back then. In his place, I do have another dad. It's my stepdad. He's been my stepdad now for 33 years. And so he's the one that I go to for advice and spiritual stuff. My stepdad's a Christian. And again, I mentioned if I mention somebody, if I mention my dad, I'm usually talking about him. So if I say my mom and dad, that means I'm talking about my stepdad and my mom, because he really is more of a dad to me than my biological father. And so he plays a very important role in my life. But sometimes we have the wrong people in there. For instance, there was this young lady that I was counseling in California. She had been married 4 or 5 times, and she had 5 or 6 kids. I think 4 different dads on those. And she was coming to me for counsel, and she kept saying, why do I keep having troubles with my relationships and so forth? And I told her it's very simple. I said, you have a broken picker. And she went, what? What do you mean a broken picker? I said, you keep picking the wrong ones. You've got a broken picker. The issue is, in her own family life, and around her table were all of her exes, and her own family, her dad, who was a very poor influence on her life. And so she had a broken picker. And so I told her, until you can get your life together and focus on your life on Christ, you're going to continue to have these issues. A few months later, she met another man, and I told her, please do not go and date this guy or anything. She moved in with them. And I told her it was going to be a bit of a mistake, and sure enough, 6 months later, they were broken up again. Fortunately, she didn't get pregnant. But the point was that she went on and on and on, and she kept focusing on her own self, and she never chose to get rid of the people who had too much influence in her life. And the person who should have had the most influence was Christ. But she chose instead to put herself in that place, and also to have too many people that were the wrong people in her life. You see, either we can sense wisdom and go after it, or we can try to do it ourselves. That was the problem with Israel. So again, what is the role and duties of a king? Let's see what Israel thought a king should do. Well, let's have some fun first. I'm asking you guys a question, and you can answer if you'd like. I heard you laugh, so I know that your voices work. What would be the first law you institute if you became king? What would be the first law you institute? You don't have to be spiritual about it. You can talk like it is. Like if you were a king, truly king, what would you do?
A whole week off at Christmas for everybody.
Did you say that again?
A whole week off at Christmas for everybody.
Oh, a whole week off for Christmas for everyone? I like that rule. How many of us vote for Roxy for king? Yeah, okay, there we go. You have our vote. We have our vote, Roxy. Anybody else? No wars? Okay, I like that one too.
No more Mondays.
No more Mondays? You just probably overtook Roxy for king. Well, went online and I found some funnies. I'm not going to read all of them, just to read a couple here. It says, I'm officially crowned as king? Oh, fun. Let the tyranny begin. You know what he had in mind. Everyone under my rule is obligated to own at least one cat. If you own more, I, as your king, will have a positive bias towards you, and perhaps some sympathy when your family runs out of food. Failure to abide by this will result in public execution by either beheading or hanging, depending on the severity of your crime and how much you evaded my rule. Another one said, immediately abolish the monarchy to form a totalitarian dictatorship. I don't have the class, pomp, or money to live as a king. I'd want to focus on military power instead of politics. My first law would be the law of conscription. In the time of war, all able-bodied men ages 18 to 30 must fight in the army. Let's see here. This guy said, what a great question. I'm presuming you're asking if we become an absolute monarch, in my case, Canada. I think my first law would be to retroactively veto the Quebec Act of 1774. I'm like, seriously? Why is he even more focused on that? I have no idea how he goes into a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to read it because it didn't make sense to me either. Number 4 is, I will help the poor people and try to go towards of its poverty. Not very good English. I will give the facilities of his choice to everyone. Development came when a man of faith of yourselves and standard. He has poor English. I shouldn't have read that one. Let me see. If I was king with unlimited power, my first law would be that restricted the king's power to the amount of power that I would consider acceptable if my enemy was king. Not too bad. Some interesting ideas. You know, we all have this idea of what we'd like to be king, and you know, like if we were to win the lottery, we all figured out how we're going to spend it, you know, and all that sort of stuff. So we'll have in our mind all these things. In the story of Matthew, God knows that we have this penchant for wanting to control things ourselves. If you remember the story, Matthew has been told in a dream, and actually the wise men told him about what was happening, so they left, and then he left for Egypt. Now the temptation would be to go down to Egypt and either stay there forever. That's Lot. Israel went there a lot. But God said to him, I will reveal to you when it's time to come back. Because he knew that we as people have that the possibility that we'll take control and we'll do it ourselves. You see, there's uncertainty a lot of times when it comes to our life. In verse 5, it says here, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like the nations. Because they didn't know what his son was going to do. If you remember, before that, Eli had 2 sons that were horrible. So that's when Samuel came on board, and Samuel became basically the main judge. But then Samuel's own boys were having problems. So Israel was like, what's it going to be like under their rule? Maybe Samuel's a great guy, but his 2 boys, they're horrible. So they decided, you know, we can't do this. We got to have a king. They wanted to be like other nations. They thought a king would provide them some stability. You see, they asked for a couple things. They thought first that he would protect them, as God had done during the time of the judges. But here's the thing. They thought that the failure during the time of the judges was due to the judges themselves and not themselves. They hadn't learned the lesson. That it was when they failed to follow God, that's when these other nations came against them. They also thought that by him doing so, he would judge them rightly. They were hoping that he would give them justice, like Moses had. They've heard all the stories of Moses and all the justice that he gave them. And maybe under central rule, they could have that again. And then, of course, they wanted to be like others. So the first issue is, sometimes we become king because we're uncertain of what's going on. And we want to be in charge. The next thing is control. We want to keep control of ourselves. So in Matthew, in chapter 2, verse 7 through 8, and in 1 Samuel 8:6, it says, But the thing displeased Samuel when he said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, and we have the rest. You see, the risk is we try to do things on our own. We try to make our own selves the king. We want to be our own selves. You know, even in our elections, folks, that we sometimes choose things that are not necessarily the right thing for us as a country, focusing on the wrong things. You know, it's very interesting. Do you know that 90% of all elections in the last 100 years is won by the candidate who's taller? Seriously. And so 90% of all elections were won by the taller person. So if you're a short guy, don't run for president. The second thing is that Saul was, and this is later on in the next couple of chapters, Saul was also good looking. They voted in someone who was good looking. Because we focus on the exterior, not on the heart. And then lastly, Samuel chose Saul, and Saul was a very wealthy man. His dad had many animals. And so they looked for someone who they thought he'd be a great leader. Good looking, tall, and he's wealthy. Surely, a man of means can rule over us. Sometimes we do that of ourselves. Like, I can do it. I'm pretty smart. I'm a pretty good guy. I'll do the right thing. I'll take control of my life. In fact, this call for a king was so important to Israel, they asked for it 3 separate occasions to have a king. It was so important to them. Even after Samuel told them how bad it would be. The next thing is their tendency of fear. 1 Samuel 8:7 says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." They didn't want God reigning over them. You know, in those days, succession of leaders was either done through your children or assassination. So the reality is they could have had any king they wanted or any judge they wanted. They could have assassinated Samuel's boys and got somebody else in place. It's so funny because later on, when they did have kings, under Judah, the sons of the kings became king. But then under Israel, half the time the new king was someone that assassinated the previous king. And so those two options became apparent even within the kingship. Samuel says to them, yes, you'll get protection, but this is also what's going to happen. He's going to make you join his army. He's going to take away your wealth. He's going to take away your women. All the things that you're wanting, you're going to lose. And that's what happens when we put ourselves in charge. Fear makes you do really irrational things. Got a story to reveal a little bit about myself as a young man. I am old, so I did see Jaws in the theater. Yeah, 1975, I can remember. So my best friend and I went to see Jaws. And I had heard all about it, all the gory stuff, so that's why I went to see it, except there was one part I wasn't told about, and it scared the bejeebies out of me. So we went and saw this movie, and by the time the movie was over, Chris, my best friend, and I, we were scared to death. So we go home, and we're spending the night at his house. Problem. Chris had a waterbed. Yeah. We slept on the floor that night. Yep, we sure did. Fear makes you do stupid things. I mean, seriously, there's going to be a shark in his waterbed. But we did. We were so afraid. Fear had so grasped our heart that we said, we're not going to take any chances. I'm sleeping on the floor tonight. Now, poor Chris, he had to go back to that waterbed the next night. I got to go home to my mattress, so I don't know how many days he slept on the floor. But the point is that fear makes us do dumb things, and that's exactly what was happening with Israel, is they were making a very dumb decision. They were wanting to put a king in this place when it should have been God. And the last thing that we can find from these stories is sin. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me. That's such a sad thing. We reject God. We don't put him in his rightful place. Saul started out a pretty good guy. did some good stuff, immediately started winning some battles. And then all of a sudden there was a big battle he was about ready to go into. And he was calling for Samuel to come and do the sacrifice. And he was so concerned, and he had so much concern in his heart that something was going to happen. He decided to do the sacrifice himself. Good intentions, really good intentions. Even if you think about it in the place of Herod, in his eyes, it was good intentions to get rid of these little baby boys. Because, we want stability. All this uncertainty of who this king is going to be. We can't have that happening. And the same is true with this time here. So Saul chose to do the sacrifice instead, and that's when he lost his position as king, and David was chosen instead. What would we be tempted to do if we were in charge? Well, we do it all the time. And we put ourselves in that chair. We start making those decisions ourselves. You see, there's a natural tendency of a king to make servants of his people rather than to serve themselves. And he says, this is here, he will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Doesn't that reveal so much about us? That when we do get into control, and then when we mess up, and we cry out to God, God, why are you doing this to me? Hello, you're the one that decided to put yourself on the throne instead of me. And that was the problem with Israel. They thought the problem was these other invading people. So what's the result of a king? First of all, impiety, corruption, disorder. Saul, he no longer had a love for God. He decided to do things himself. He was corrupt as could be. Creating great disorder and slavery. In fact, this slavery continued on through David into Solomon, and that's why the kingdom split, was because they said to him, you have enslaved our people to build all this stuff. David built the big house, Solomon built the big temple, and everyone had been slaves, and they finally had had enough of about 100 years of slavery under the rule of a king. And they cried out, but it was they who had chosen to do this. And they had endless war that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And ultimately, this idea of putting people in place of a king failed. In 722 BC, Israel was taken into captivity. And then 125, 130 years later, Judah joined them. Because it was a failure. We cannot have a king over ourselves, and we cannot be ourselves the king. So what does it mean for us? Our fear causes us to assume control. We know that Christ is the answer, but sometimes it's hard to let go and let him rule. We want stability and protection in our lives, but too often we wrestle control away because of fear and uncertainty. We want to be in charge ourselves. Eric and I were talking the other day about George Patton, and it reminded me of something in his very own life. If you know George Patton, he was a World War II general. He was a very talented general. And he knew that God had a special plan for him. He was a very devout Christian. I've read a couple of biographies about him. I know when you watch the movie, he was very colorful. But the reality was he was a very good man. But there was a time when he realized that he did not have the power to make a change. And so he asked his chaplain to write a prayer to ask for good weather. Because he himself knew that he could not do this. And he took himself out of that control, and he gave it to a chaplain, and that chaplain prayed. And the very next day, the weather cleared enough that the American Air Force, Army Air Force, was able to go over and bomb the Germans, and was able to end, and what happened was the 82nd Airborne was stuck in this little town, and he was able to break that and get in there and save them. And it's because he'd given over control back to God instead of himself. He was very talented, and he knew it. The reality is he knew that he had to rely on God. So how do we live this out? First question is, who's sitting around your table? But the next and most important question is, who is at the head of your table? Why do we insist on ruling? God's sufficient for us. You know, I took this quote out of a book. Nothing intoxicates some people like a sip of authority. And if there's anything small, shallow, or ugly about a person, giving him a little authority will bring it out. When I am my own king, I'm convinced of myself that I can do it. And I can rule it better than anybody else. Don't we do that? We think we can do it ourselves. And we're better at it than anybody else. If we want the life that we want, we feel like we have to be in charge. There are times when we've given ourselves over to the king. Sometimes hardship came. We think that that's, how could God possibly do that to us? We're going to be talking about some of those issues in January. But today, I want you to understand that when we put ourselves in that throne, when we're the one that's in charge, we don't make the right decisions. We act out of fear. We act out of uncertainty. We want control. And unfortunately, we do it many times because of sin. And if we can recognize that in our life, we can recognize that the right person that belongs here is not us, but it's Jesus. He's the rightful king. And so next week, we're going to be talking about him as king. And what does it mean when Jesus is a king? And how do we know that he's the king in there? Let's pray.